Liberty of conscience has become something that's of great interest to me. I was raised, of course, in an Adventist home, and I always grew up kind of with an idea of, religious liberty was going to be something that we would deal with as a church, but I always kind of have attached it more to just, Sunday law, which I totally believe in, but, something that's off in the future. And more recently, last few years, as I've been, observing things going on in our country, around the world, I realize, liberty of conscience is a broad, deep subject, and I wanted to learn more about it. And I've been reading as fast as I can. I'm no expert, I can tell you that. The more I read, the more I learn, the more I know I didn't know. Here's a recent, almost embarrassing example, but what was it, last night, Brian asked, not because he didn't know, but, Ricky to clarify a statement from one of the pioneers on republicanism. And, I gave my 6th grade answer, and then several in the room gave the master's degree textbook explanation, which, I actually went back and read the 1828 Webster Dictionary, and in fact, he says there's a difference between democracy and a republic. And we are supposed to be a republic, not a democracy. So I'm just saying that I'm continually learning and still, wanting to be able to articulate these things in connection with our Adventist history, because it's part of our Adventist history as well. So tonight, what I thought I would do, because I've like Bob mentioned, I did several presentations at AFCO. I had a sermon a few weeks ago, and there's no way to cram it into an hour, and so I thought I'd just pull out some principles that I want to talk about tonight, and then tomorrow I want to talk about 1888 itself, the 1888 Minneapolis meetings, and just talk about how one of those subjects that Jones presented on was religious liberty, and even following that when he went to Battle Creek. So now another point I'll bring out is that, as usual, when I start a presentation, I work through all my material, and I collect information, and I start making slides, and I'm afraid I'm not going to have enough slides. And then this morning I realized, those poor people, I better get rid of half these slides, which I did. So with that in mind, I will begin here with, this actually wasn't, I'm going to go through 9 principles, and this, I don't know why I didn't add this as the first principle, but this was kind of part of my introductory remarks. And the context for this is Leon Smith, the son of Uriah Smith, wrote to Ellen White and asked her the question, what do you do in teaching religious liberty to non-Adventist students? And so this was her response, and Rick and I actually talked about this, and I think it's a good principle to think about in regard to religious liberty. This is how Ellen White answered his question. In advocating religious liberty sentiments, you might be pressed in argument to take so decided a stand that you would build a wall between yourself and those whom you sought to enlighten, and failing to draw them toward the truth, you would fail to do them good. That which you might say in regard to religious liberty might be all truth, and yet, because of an untimely introduction and over-positive utterance, you might bring about alienation between yourself and those you would instruct. And so, obviously, I'm not speaking to non-Adventists, I'm not speaking to students, I'm talking to my peers. But it is a principle I want to follow, and Ricky and I talked about this, I'm a learner in all of this, and I don't want to come across as in any way that you better hear what I have to say or else. And so that's the principle that I want to follow as I go through these 9 principles. And again, these are not in any particular order. These are, in many ways, I'm preaching to the choir, but it's just some new that I haven't understood before, but ideas I think we need to consider as we're looking at liberty of conscience today. And so, don't get nervous. I didn't vote for any of these people. And here's why I'm saying this. What I'm presenting is not driven by a political view. And I don't think whenever we present, it shouldn't be driven by a political view, or a political party, I should say. Because I believe that both parties are corrupt. And I'll clarify that in just a moment. God raised up this government, but we are not to be a part of political parties and driven by so much that goes on in the political world. Now, obviously, we're not to start anarchy or that kind of thing either, and certainly we can support issues, but we're not to be joining a party because ultimately, which I'd like to show tonight, devil is using both parties to move towards one direction, and that is to do away with our liberties in this country. This is what Uriah Smith had to say. He said, political corruption is preparing the way for deeper sin. It pervades all parties. Look at the dishonest means resorted to obtain office, the bribery, the deceptions, the ballot stuffing. He wrote this 1870s in his book, United States and Religious Liberty, and then it was expanded when it became the Marvel of Nations. And I really appreciated Uriah Smith's book, reading it several of his works. He was really a scholar, and it makes me realize how sad it is that, the 1888 contention came in. This is what Ellen White said in 1897. She says, "There is a danger, a decided danger, for all who shall link themselves up with the political parties of the world. There is fraud on both sides. God has not laid upon any of our people the burden of linking up with either party. We are under the Christ banner, and everyone who names the name of Christ is to depart from iniquity." Again, one other place, I'll show on our slide here. She says, "But what kind of spirit takes hold upon our people when those who believe we are under the third angel's message, the last message of mercy to the world, brothers in the same faith, appear wearing the badges of opposing political parties, proclaiming opposite sentiments, and declaring their divided opinions?" And I actually have a concern about this, in our own church. And in that, the more we get involved into politics, the more controversy that is created. And again, I'm not suggesting there's not issues we should be standing for. And the pioneers did stand for issues, and we'll look at some of them tonight. But as I'm reading through, I realized they distanced themselves from the political parties and stood on the platform of truth. So that's number one principle, I guess, if I'm calling them principles. Number two, liberty concepts are found in many places. You may not suspect them, at least for me. This is what I'm finding as I'm reading more on these topics. I'm running across them in areas I never saw before. My wife and I have been reading through Patriarchs and Prophets, and we've done it before. We got to the story of Samuel and the children of Israel who decided they wanted a king. And all of a sudden, lights went on that I never realized before. I don't know where, I never saw it in this light. So notice that I'm just going to quote a little bit from this chapter, how Ellen White describes it. She says, "Samuel was instructed to grant the request of the people for a king, but to warn them of the Lord's disapproval and also make known what would be the result of their course. He faithfully set before them the burdens that would be laid upon them and showed the contrast between such a state of oppression and their present comparatively free and prosperous condition." So here's the nation, they lived under a theocracy, but it was under the God of the universe who invented liberty of conscience and was just in every situation. And they chose instead a monarchy. I don't know why I didn't think of that, as they chose a monarchy, which so oftentimes can end in tyranny and despotism and so forth. And Ellen White continues talking about this story. "However burdensome its exactions should be found, when once a monarchy was established, they could not set it aside at pleasure." So once Israel went down this road, they had to stick with that plan B, so to speak. And when there was a good king, things went much better. But when there was a king that went astray, it brought all Israel, into bondage in both sometimes civil and sometimes religious situations. Though the nation had despised Samuel's warnings, the faithful prophet, while forced to yield to their desires, still endeavored as far as possible to guard their liberties. And again, this is just an example for me of reading through, Bible stories that I never saw a religious liberty or liberty of conscience component as has jumped out more recently as I've been reading through on this subject. Principle number 3, and again, this is, I'm preaching to the choir, but it's just been impressed upon me even more how the whole great controversy is really built on this issue, at least in part, over the issue of liberty of conscience. And, we could spend a whole, hour just talking about this. But Satan's kingdom versus Christ's kingdom, which is, based on liberty of conscience and choice, a free choice. The book of Deuteronomy, obviously God talks about how God constantly gave that choice and tells the consequences, because there are consequences. But God constantly gave that free choice through, and you find this throughout the book of the Bible. Now, the Bible nowhere says the word, liberty of conscience, but the principles are found from Genesis 3:15 all the way down to through the book of Revelation. But there's another component of liberty of conscience, or this liberty issue in the great controversy, and that is the issue that God is wanting us to be free from sin, not just to have a free choice, but to choose life and to have liberty of sin. And this one statement, I just pulled this from Great Controversy: God never forces the will or the conscience, but Satan's constant resort to gain control of those whom he cannot otherwise seduce is compulsion by cruelty. And then notice, he uses fear or force, either one. He endeavors to rule the conscience and secure homage to himself. To accomplish this, he works through both religious and secular authorities. And here's another aspect, really, that we'll be touching on tonight. Satan uses both religious and secular, religious and civil liberties, moving them to enforce the human law in defiance of God's law. So here's how one person kind of summarized this, and I like the way this puts it, talking about God's government. Liberty is the right to choose, but freedom is the result of the right choice. And that's ultimately what God, he wants us to choose life. So, there's a lot of people that are calling for liberty, but sometimes it's liberty to sin, really. Satan's government, maybe could be summarized more like this. Censorship is the tool used when the lie loses its power. And of course, Satan, the father of lies, he seeks to, control the world through his lies, and if that doesn't work, then he tries, and you put other words here for censorship. You can put coercion, compulsion, force, persecution. Satan uses that when his lies lose their power. Well, principle number 4 that I wanted to touch on tonight, and Ricky kind of touched on this, and this is the concept of Satan using a multifocal attack. And this has been of great interest to me, more, as I've studied this topic of religious liberty, in seeing how Satan has kind of the model that Satan has used in the past, and I see this model being used over and over, and I compare it to maybe perhaps how the Satan is working today. And Ricky mentioned this in the time of Christ. You had Pharisee and Sadducee, and Rome, who both factions who fought against one another came together in crucifying Christ. And we're all aware of that. What's interesting is when Jesus warned the disciples of the leaven, he didn't really differentiate between the Pharisee and the Sadducee. Now, obviously, Jesus dealt with their particular errors at times when he was addressing them. But when he warned the disciples of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, he didn't really differentiate that there was any difference basically between their underlying problem, which I find interesting. And another interesting point is in Mark 3:6, Jesus actually says, beware, Mark records it as, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod. And another thing to recall is that the Sadducees were in the ascendancy, in power. I think Caiaphas was a Sadducee. And the Pharisees hated the Romans, but when Jesus healed the man with the withered hand, it was the Pharisees who went to the Herodians to try to conspire against Jesus. And so here you have, one group that's more anti-government, one group that's more pro-government, Sadducees. And yet in the end, they both colluded together with the Romans in this threefold union to crucify Christ. And again, I see this as a model that Satan has used in the past, and I think he continues to use it. The two sects, Pharisees and Sadducees, had been at bitter enmity. The Sadducees courted the favor of ruling power in order to maintain their position and authority. The Pharisees, on the other hand, fostered the popular hatred against the Romans, longing for the time when they could throw off the yoke of the conqueror. But Pharisees and Sadducees now united against Christ. And again, what was it in their spirit that led them to do that, even though you would never guess in that day, how could they ever get together and agree on one thing? And yet they did. It's interesting, too, that, of course, the Romans and the Sadducees and the Pharisees persecuted Christians after the resurrection until the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. But unfortunately, the persecution didn't stop there. The pagan Rome continued that persecution. So again, Satan used Pharisees, Sadducees, he used the Romans, the pagan Romans. Notice, great controversy, Ellen White says, the chief agent of Satan in making war upon Christ and his people during the first centuries of the Christian era was the Roman Empire, in which paganism was the prevailing religion. It was a religion. Jones brings us out, and I won't have time to go into that, but in the talks he actually gave at Minneapolis, he brings this point out about paganism being, a religion of Rome. Well, what does Revelation 13 talk about? That dragon Rome gave its seat and its power to the papacy that took its place after uprooting, 3 of those horns. And did the persecution stop? Was there more liberty after papal Rome took over? And of course the answer is absolutely not. For 1,260 years, Satan used papal Rome to persecute Christians. And of those 50 million, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, 50 million martyrs that died during those 1,260 years, it was for all kinds of reasons. Civil, religious reasons. It wasn't just Sunday laws, and I'll mention that again later. This is what Ellen White says, Signs of the Times. Through paganism and then through the papacy, Satan exerted his power for many centuries in an effort to blot from the earth God's faithful witnesses. Pagans and papists were actuated by the same dragon spirit. They differed only in that the papacy, making a pretense of serving God, was the more dangerous and cruel foe. So interesting, it's that dragon spirit that actuated papacy and paganism. And it's that same dragon spirit that's going to speak in our day. Here's another statement, great controversy. I'll try to pull this all together. There is a striking similarity between the Church of Rome and the Jewish church at the time of Christ's first advent. Now I realize this obviously means, more than just one thing. But put that together with the statement, great controversy, a few pages later, that where Ellen White talking about Protestantism says this: a prayerful study of the Bible should show Protestants the real character of the papacy and would cause them to abhor and shun it. The papacy is well adapted to meet the wants of all these. It is prepared for 2 classes of mankind, embracing nearly the whole world. Those who would be saved by their merits and those who would be saved in their sins. here is the secret of its power. So, if the Jewish nation and the Church of Rome are similar, is it possible they're similar in the same way that the Jewish nation was at the time of Christ, where you had Sadducee and Pharisee who fought but still came together? And the papacy represents two really diametrically different ideas, that you can be saved by your merits, Pharisaism, or you can be saved in your sin, Sadduceeism. And is this part of that model that Satan has used in distracting a nation, distracting a church, distracting, and yet using both opposing parties to further his cause? And then think about that in our day, where we have, even in our country, factions that you would say these can never come together and agree on anything, and yet is it possible for Satan to use both factions to destroy the foundations that this country was built on? Interesting that Ellen White describes this as the secret of the papacy's power, is this concept that she's just described. I took the quote out. One of the slides I unfortunately took out was one where she describes the United States and the two principles, those two horns, representing civil and religious liberty. That's the secret of the U.S.'s power as a nation, is in those two principles, Protestantism and Republicanism. Well, that's an area of study I'm still looking into. But the principle of Satan using opposing forces to ultimately still come to the end that he is pushing for. And how do we see that today in our own country and around the world? Number 5, principle, civil and religious liberty. And Ricky mentioned this last night. This is something, again, I think I just had this concept, liberty of conscience is talking about religious liberty, and that's primarily dealing with Sunday laws. And again, I'm in no way suggesting there are not going to be Sunday laws. I know in our church today that, there's kind of different ends of the spectrum, no pun intended, where some on one side are just throwing out the Great Controversy completely, or even a modification of it. Well, there may be Sunday laws, but it's certainly not going to follow the Great Controversy's description of it. On the other side, it's maybe the extreme of resetting dates and looking for, every time the Pope sneezes, trying to come up with some, to force prophecy. And of course we want to avoid either of those extremes, but I find myself more in the middle of that. But again, my concept has been more, religious liberty of conscience, that's religious liberty, and that's sometime in the future when Sunday laws come. And not realizing that liberty of conscience has been an issue, from the very first when this nation was raised, that Satan has sought different ways to destroy that liberty. And recognizing liberty of conscience as a much broader thing. So just a few statements again. I realize Ricky covered this last night. But those who first found an asylum on the shores of America rejoiced that they had reached a country free from the arrogant claims of popery and the tyranny of kingly rule. They determined to establish a government upon the broad foundation of civil and religious liberty. And truly that's why they came. Again, they didn't come to escape persecution just over the day of worship. They came to escape persecution in every area of their life. You couldn't look into a telescope and come to the conclusion that, the earth circled the sun instead of the other way around, because, Rome had a way of looking at science, and that's the only way you could look at it. Here's what Ellen White says on this. Interesting. She says, we are engaged in an important and an essential work. We must carry on aggressive warfare. We are to stand for the true Protestant principles, for the policies of the papacy will edge their way into every place possible to proscribe or forbid liberty of conscience. So again, I see this as I'm, even reading through Spirit of Prophecy, things I haven't seen before, where Ellen White describes, liberty issues as including both civil and religious liberty, and she ascribes that to, the papacy fighting against more than just religious liberty. There are civil liberty issues that come into play and that we need to be aware of. Well, principle number 6. And I'll spend just a little bit of time on this. Ellen White's broad view on liberty of conscience. I was surprised at how she applies liberty of conscience. So I want to just look at a few of these statements. One statement here on the idea of how do we treat those in our homes. Did you ever think about liberty of conscience in your own home? So here's the context. Ellen White's in Europe, 1885. There's a young man, well, I'm assuming he's young. He wants to get married. But the girl he wants to marry, her father is not interested in him marrying his daughter. So this young man, Jules Foucher, writes to Ellen White, and I think was hoping she would help him out. This is what she said, and I'm going to read all this because I want you to get the context here. Now, my brother, there are several shown me in this continent, she's in Europe, who were not in a position to do all the good that they might do in the capacity of laborers. Some who had made a great mistake in their labors, they were very narrow in their ideas. They felt that it was their privilege to be conscience for others. They must make a raid against dress and would take on the great burdens in reference to the dress of the sisters. These men were not, while doing this, actuated by the Spirit of God, but they were prompted by their own spirit. And then she hits home, gets to the point of his question, and she says to this young man, I think you are one of this class, who, had you a wife, would want that she should lose her identity in you. You prescribe for her what she should wear, what she should do, and you would leave her no liberty of conscience. You would be dictatorial, overbearing, and crush out individual independence. Anyways, I never read this before. I thought, man, there's actual... Now, I'm not suggesting that the Constitution covers, this argument in your home, per se. But it's interesting that Ellen White applies the idea of liberty of conscience in a much broader sense than I had seen before. It includes areas of our life that we might think, how do you treat people in your own home? She also applies it in a broad way as well to our, in our own church. Now, I had collected over the years many statements, which I took out from this presentation, where Ellen White addresses how we treat those in our own church. And these were all written, at least the ones I found, post-1888, and she's addressing things like the Confederacy that was being set up in Battle Creek. She was dealing with issues revolving the Review and Herald, the General Conference, control over the writers and their royalties. There's letters where she addresses, like Wagner's views on the covenant that were squashed down by the book committee. She addresses issues like Prescott. He went to Armadale. They reprinted, his sermons, sent him to Battle Creek. Book committee condemned him for doctrinal error. So many of these comments that she makes, she's addressing those kind of things. Control over the American Sentinel, control over other leaders and laity. And so I'm just going to read 3 different statements here where Ellen White, again, her broad view of liberty of conscience and how she applies it to the home. Here's how she applies it to us in the church. I wrote nearly 100 pages long before my husband died of what would be transacted in the Review and Herald office. By the way, when did James White die? 1881. So this would have been, she says, years before. So sometime before that, she wrote about the subject, which is interesting to me. It was made clear to me that light would be rejected, that warnings would be despised, that a spirit of selfishness would be cultivated in the office, and would turn human agents away from their right. Religious and business liberty would labor to control. So here's another term I've never even heard of, I don't remember reading this, business liberty. So again, Ellen White's applying liberty of conscience concepts to what was going on at the Review and Herald office there. And obviously you'd want to read the entire letter and get the context and all of that. But they would work to have every Seventh-day Adventist institution in subordination to the institutions in Battle Creek, and manipulate things so that every branch of the work would be centered and controlled by responsible men in the Review and Herald office. Religious liberty means more to us as a people than many take it to mean. So again, as I'm looking through all of these things, I realize Ellen White had a broad view of liberty of conscience. It's another letter. The question of religious liberty, and by the way, this is written the same summer, 1895, the question of religious liberty needs to be clearly comprehended by our people in more ways than one. So again, she's making it clear there's more than, religious liberty covers many things. With outstretched arms, men are seeking to steady the ark, and the anger of the Lord is kindled against them because they think that their position entitles them to say what the Lord's servants shall do and what they shall not do. They think themselves competent to decide what shall be brought before God's people and what should be repressed. And think about this, when you think about 1888 history, how unfortunately this played out at that time. The Lord inquires of them, who has required this at your hand? Who has given you the burden of being conscience for my people? By what spirit are you guided and controlled when you seek to restrict their liberty? There is an evil, a great evil, that is to be rooted out of all council meetings and board meetings. When we are living in perilous times, men are striving for the control over their fellow men. Has not religious freedom been excluded from your assemblies? By the way, Ellen White herself suffered from this situation. Her book, The Great Controversy, set in the basement of the Review office because the colporteurs were being encouraged not to sell her book, but other books for greater profit. And I think it was 1891, she was traveling back east, and she wired back to get more money because she's traveling, evangelism, and they told her, A.R. Henry told her, sorry, you're too much in debt. We can't forward you any money. And she had $7,000 of her own money tied up in the Great Controversy. So again, Ellen White suffered under some of these same things, and that's why she's addressing it. Like the Jews, one last letter here, like the Jews, we may have much to say about religious liberty and yet suffer the same spirit. And did they not suffer the same spirit? They hated the persecution they received from the Romans, but they dealt it out in the same way. To steal upon us as it came upon the Jews, and find that oppression is exercised among those who preached liberty. We may find that men may make moves and propose measures that will bind the conscience of their brethren, and they will speak as though they thought themselves God. Let the men in our institutions who are in danger of following in the footsteps of Rome call a halt and inquire what methods that, if followed out, will kill religious liberty. And again, this is 1895. Ellen White, God is leading her to be straight and to address some of these things. But again, liberty of conscience, she's not applying it to issues out in the world. She was dealing with issues in the home. She dealt with issues in our own church. And so I see liberty of conscience in a much broader way the more I study. Number 7, how are we doing? Are everyone okay? We're not? Okay. Number 7, the moral conditions in America. And this I'm kind of, going away a little bit from the principles. I mean, this is a principle, but bringing it more down to kind of where Ricky left off yesterday in regard to what happened in America. And the reason I'm trying to bring this all together is I'm beginning to realize that, it's not just a religious right that comes in to bring an end to liberty in our country. It's certainly going to be involved. But Satan uses this multifocal attack. He brings immorality to destroy a nation, and then oppressive laws are enacted, and he uses any way he can to destroy a nation, and this was one of them. Now, I had no idea until I started looking into what was the moral condition following 1844, because I knew Ellen White had some things to say about it, but what what has been written about that in secular press. And I was amazed at what has been written about the decline in morality in the United States in the 1840s and the 1850s. And I pulled out most of the slides. And many of the Adventist pioneers address this, by the way. One was an article written by a lady about the gold rush. And I had no idea the debauchery that was going on in California around the gold rush, and legalized, it wasn't really legalized by law, but prostitution and there was all kinds of, there was persecutions going on there too, and Chinese were mistreated and all kinds of things. So anyways, here's what Uriah Smith says about this in his book, Marvel of Nations. And I just want to look at a few of his statements on what was going on in this country, which set up a situation for Satan to come in from another angle. This would have been, now Uriah Smith is writing this, he wrote it in 1876 initially, and then this is, I'm actually quoting from his 1887 edition, but he wrote it earlier than that, and if you read the whole chapter, he's talking about events that happened prior to this. The people of the United States are not all saints, he says. The masses, notwithstanding all our gospel light and gospel privilege, are still in a position for Satan to suddenly fire their hearts with the basest of impulses. This nation, as we have seen, is to exist to the coming of Christ. And the Bible very fully sets forth the moral condition of the people in the last days that immediately precede that event. Now, I'm familiar with these texts, but somehow I'd never put it together like Uriah Smith does here, and recognize that this was happening in early Advent days. Iniquity is to abound, and the love of many is to wax cold, Matthew 24. Evil men and seducers are to wax worse and worse, 2 Timothy. Scoffers are to arise, saying, where is the promise of his coming, 2 Peter. The whole land is to be full of violence, as it was in the days of Noah, and full of licentiousness, as was in the days of Sodom. Luke and Lot, Luke 17. And when the Lord appears, faith will scarcely be found upon the earth, Luke 18. And those who are ready for his coming will be but a little flock. And then notice what he follows then is what's interesting to me. And there are elements already in existence which furnish a luxuriant soil for a baleful crop of future evil. In other words, even if we don't see it all happening today, this immorality that's happening, he's talking about that time, is setting up a situation which will coincide or work with those final events. Our nation has grown so rapidly in wealth that it stands today as the richest nation in the world. True. Wealth leads to luxury, luxury to corruption, and corruption to the breaking down of all moral barriers, and then the way is open for the worst passions to come to the front and for the worst principles to bear rule. And then notice, this is the last paragraph of this section that I'm quoting. In addition to this, we have spiritualism, I was aware of that, infidelity, okay, socialism, free love, the trade unions or labor against capital, communism, all assiduously spreading their principles among the masses. These are the very principles that worked among the people as the exciting cause just prior to the terrible French Revolution of 1789 to 1800. By the way, I think his use of the word exciting isn't how we usually use it. It means more the provoking or the influencing or the prompting of those events. So he's describing what we would say more as a liberal, left-leaning ideology. And this was taking place in the 1800s, which set up, what I'll talk about in a little bit, Sunday laws that came in as a pendulum response. This was going on 1840s, 50s, 60s. Human nature is the same in all ages, and like causes will surely produce like effect. These causes are now in an active operation, and how soon they will culminate in a state of anarchy and a reign of terror as much more frightful than the French Revolution, as they are now more widely extended, no man can say. So again, this principle I would say is that Satan uses multifocal attack and that in this very time, the moral decay of our country was destroying liberties at that very time and setting up for even greater destruction of liberties in the future, which I will address next. Number 8, speaking like a dragon. I've always kind of had the idea, and as I've read more and more, articles, even recently, I think maybe perhaps sometimes we've looked at this, and I'll just speak of myself, looked at this as an idea that, God raises up this beast in Revelation 13, a beast with lamb-like horns, and then, it's like a dispensational beast. It's a lamb-like beast, and then it turns into a dragon. Whereas some of the pioneers, and I unfortunately took out most, I had over 20 some slides from different pioneers writing on this, and I think they saw it more not as a dispensational beast, but a beast where the 2 horns aren't plucked up. They're always there till Christ comes and destroys that beast. But there's a time where it begins to speak like a dragon, and the pioneers begin to see this even in their day. They didn't just apply it to the future and a Sunday law. They saw it speaking like a dragon in their very day and over different issues that were taking place. And so this is from Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 4. Ellen White, of course, had her dream 1858. Great controversy. She wrote Spiritual Gifts, and then that was enlarged in the Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1 through 4, and then became the Conflict of the Ages series. Now, this is in the appendix, so I can't say that Ellen White actually wrote this, but she would have endorsed or okayed the appendix in her book in 1884. But notice what is stated here. She says, or whoever wrote the appendix, the 2-horned beast appears in 2 phases, with gentleness of a lamb and fierceness of the dragon. This has, to some extent, already been shown in the inconsistency of sending forth to the world the doctrine of the equality of all men in respect to natural rights, the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, quoting from our documents, founding documents, and yet upholding by law all the evils of American slavery. And as I said, the pioneers saw that this beast with lamb-like horns spoke like a dragon in other areas, but they really did address this issue of slavery the most, and at least that I found so far. And so that's what several slides from this about this subject. This is from an article 1860. Someone evidently had written into the review and said, you've misquoted, the fugitive law, or you're using it inappropriately or not applying it appropriately. And so the review in this article by J.B. Frisbee, he quotes the portion of the fugitive slave law, and then he writes this as a preamble to that, or as an introduction. He says, "We have been accused of not quoting this law correctly. We have therefore taken pains to procure the law and copy out the part that we make use of to show the dragon voice from the dragon mouth of the 2-horned beast." So here they were addressing an issue in their day, not involving religious liberty issues, but a civil liberty in regard to this Fugitive Slave Law Act, showing how it makes us all slave catchers under a penalty of $1,000 fine or 6 months imprisonment. And I'll explain, or the next article will explain what he's talking about. This fugitive, slave law, I'd heard of it, but never realized how terrible this was. Loughborough, he has several articles I've been reading through. I haven't even finished them all. This is 1854. It's the article on the 2-horned beast. And he goes through methodically. And in this, he addresses the issue of the beast speaking like a dragon already, 1850s. This lamb-like appearing government, we shall show, speaks like a dragon in more points than one. Instead of carrying out his lamb-like profession, he speaks as a dragon. Yes, that very national executive body who have before them the Declaration of Independence and profess to be carrying out its principles can pass laws by which 3,500,000 slaves can be held in bondage. And this is speaking like a dragon. And then he tells a story, kind of a fictitious story, about a slave leaving, being abused, leaving to escape because he's heard there's freedom if he can get to Europe. And how the terrible trial it is for him to, finally get to the coast where he can jump on a ship. And then Loughborough says this: you see the slave step aboard a steamer which quickly leaves the shore and bears the happy fugitive away from the land of slavery. You have seen the slave get his freedom. All is over. And then he asks, is it? The next day you find yourself pursued, summoned to appear before the bar and answer for your transgression. What have you done? Stood still and seen a slave get just what the Declaration of Independence of the United States says all men are entitled to: liberty. And now for the offense you must pay $1,000 fine. That's in 1850s money. It's huge. There's no way. This, reader, is not a fancy sketch, but a real echo of the dragon's voice. And I find this, pioneer, several different pioneer writers, Andrews, others, are addressing the issue where the United States at that time and in other situations was speaking like a dragon, and where civil and religious liberties were challenged. Well, Loughborough goes on, Protestants and Republicans both unitedly and separately speak as a dragon. And again, these are those key phrases describing civil and religious liberty. For an illustration of the acts of both Protestants and Republicans, we make the two following quotations from the New York Tribune. And so he quotes two stories, and I'll put each story on one slide. The shame of Virginia. We're in Virginia, right? Virginia has proved herself unworthy of being the birthplace of Washington, President Washington, as is shown by a recent legal decision of the state for which all citizens are responsible. Mrs. Douglas, a lady of Norfolk, was sometime since accused, as our readers may remember, of the crime, here's the crime, of teaching little to read. That's how, of course, they described it. This case has been finally adjudged by the court of Norfolk. The teacher was found guilty, sentenced to 1 month imprisonment, which sentence was immediately carried into effect, and the lady now lives in jail expiating her crime. Again, this is all in Loughborough's explanation of being United States or America speaking as a dragon in the 1850s. His second example from the New York Tribune: a mob was collected together and a lynch court was held to determine what was best to be done with a Negro who had the impudence to raise his hand against a white man. Of course, it doesn't say what white man had done to him to begin with. The lynch court decided that he should be burned at the stake. This is the United States of America. Nearly 4,000 slaves were collected from the plantation in the neighborhood to witness the scene. Numerous speeches were made by magistrates and ministers of religion, church and state, to the large concourse of slaves, warning them and telling them that the same fate awaited them if they should prove rebellious to their owners. It's really sickening when I think about it and I read about this. And yet I wonder sometimes, are we blind? Have we been blind to where our country has abused its powers and its foreign policies and other things? I'm not suggesting that, again, that we get all politically involved in all of that, but are we awake to recognize the dragon speaking, even when it's not talking about Sunday laws? So I'm going to end this section with a quotation from Ellen White's Spiritual Gifts. And again, she had the vision, 1858. The same year, she publishes, the first writing out of some of these ideas. And it's more infant form. Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1, 1858, in the chapter Sins of Babylon. And she deals with this issue of slavery at that time. And what really stuck out to me was how she talks and quotes from Revelation 18. Now, we talk about Revelation 18, the verses 1 and 2, primarily. The earth is going to be lightened with the glory of God. Amen. The message of Christ, our righteousness. Amen. But I've realized recently, I don't know, what's the rest of Revelation 18 talking about when it's talking about Babylon and the sins of Babylon and the merchants of the earth that obviously have been dealing in some kind of association with Babylon and becoming rich from that association. But notice in these slides, I just have 4 slides here, how Ellen White, you should go back really and read the whole chapter because it's fascinating. But notice, I saw the state of the different churches since the second angel proclaimed their fall, 1844. They have been growing more and more corrupt, yet they bear the name of Christ of being Christ's followers. It is impossible to distinguish them from the world. And now think about this in the context of what I just mentioned just briefly about that moral fall in the United States, during this time. I saw that since Jesus had left the most holy place, the holy place of the heavenly sanctuary, and had entered within the second veil, the churches were left as were the Jews, and they have been filling up with every unclean and hateful bird. She's quoting from Revelation 18:2. Said the angel, their sins and pride have reached unto heaven. Again, that's a quote from Revelation 18:5. An innumerable host of evil angels are spreading themselves over the whole land. The churches and religious bodies are crowded with them, and they look upon the religious bodies with exultations, for the cloak of religion covers the greatest crimes and iniquity. And then she describes slavery. All heaven beholds with indignation human beings, the workmanship of God, reduced to the lowest depths of degradation and placed on a level with brute creature by their fellow men. And professed followers of that dear Savior, whose compassion was ever moved as he witnessed human woe, heartily engage in this enormous and grievous sin and deal in slaves and the souls of men. She's quoting from Revelation 18:13 in this chapter. You really have to read the whole chapter, but probably almost a half a dozen times she's quoting from Revelation 18. God will restrain his anger but a little longer. His anger burns against this nation, and especially against the religious bodies who have sanctioned and have themselves engaged in this terrible merchandise. And again, that's an echo of the merchants spoken of in Revelation 18. Said the angel, it will be more tolerable for the heathen and papists in the day of execution of God's judgment than for such men. Now, in reading this, I initially that's talking about the final judgment. I believe that's true. But I think it meant more than that. God's anger will not cease until he has caused this land of light to drink the dregs of the cup of his fury, and until he has rewarded unto Babylon double. Reward her even as she rewarded you, double unto her double according to her works. In the cup which she hath filled, fill her double. And again, Ellen White's quoting from Revelation 18:6. And she's using it in a present tense, 1858. And the reason that I really see this as her applying it to then is what she wrote in an article 3 years later, 1861, where she quotes almost that entire first section of the sins of Babylon in Spiritual Gifts in an article in the Review, and then described how it was fulfilled at the beginning of the Civil War, with both South and North being punished for the terrible sins of slavery in this country. And again, the whole point that I'm making here is that this was an example of the United States speaking as a dragon. It's not just applying only to the future, and can it not be speaking like a dragon today and in years past. Ricky was talking about something that Jones wrote about at the turn of the century in this very regard. Well, finally, number 9, end with this, just a couple thoughts, and I'm going to actually share a little bit of facts and then kind of share the principle that I see to tie this together. In 1863, the Adventist Church officially organized, and we're familiar with that. That very same year, February 1863, the National Reform Association, not the National Rifle Association, started. And this is how Eric Syme described what happened. The secularizing of America in the 1860s disturbed Protestant Americans who feared that liberals were dechristianizing the country. To organize support, they formed the National Reform Association, and they met there in Ohio, 1863. And slavery was pointed to as one of the terrible outgrowths of this sins of the nation. And then a year later, they came up with their Constitution, and that Constitution included a Sunday law and an amendment to the United States Constitution. This was in its infant form. And this is how, I'll close with this slide, this is how Douglas Morgan kind of summarizes what was going on there, and then I'll kind of tell you the principle here. The general ethos shared by the leading Protestant denominations remained the dominant moral influence in the late 19th century America, but manifold and rapidly accelerating dangers threatened that dominance. Crime, vice, poverty, rampant overcrowded cities, huge influx of immigrants, boosting the power base of Roman Catholicism, influence of secular values in the universities, large corporations that held sway over new industrial economy. Does it sound like you're reading today's paper? Today's paper. In response, the Christian Nation Advocates or the Christian Lobby or the NRA sought to advance the reign of Christ over the nation by federal legislation. So again, here's the principle. As Seventh-day Adventists, we need to be presenting our message to the world before national Sunday laws are enforced or openly come out. Thus, we need to be awake of the liberty of conscience issues now. And this is where I feel like a sense that we're at as a country, that we have a dual-party system that's battling it out and causing chaos in our country. I'm not saying, one party doesn't have a good idea here and the other party has a good idea there. I'm not saying there aren't issues to be seen. But it's bringing our country, I think, to a position where the events will be the final events will be rapid ones. And if we wait to say, well, when I see that Sunday law in the Monday morning paper, then I'll go talk to my neighbors, because it's too late then. Now's the time, but we have to see how Satan has used this model of divergent groups creating chaos, and then Satan coming in with an answer. Now, some of the issues that are listed here are legitimate things to be concerned about, but it's the way in which it's dealt with that's the problem. One other thought that I forgot to mention earlier, we have a Supreme Court, and there's 9 justices. 6 are Roman Catholic. 1 is Presbyterian, was raised Roman Catholic, and now Presbyterian. 1 Jew and 1 Protestant. And there are Catholic justices on both sides of the aisle. And what I'm saying is if the papacy is in many ways like the Jewish nation at the time of Christ's first coming, Satan can use both sides of the aisle to be destroying liberty of conscience in our country. And my question is for me, do I recognize this? Some of the things, there's been some situations in Washington where there's encouragement to report your neighbors, or your fellow worker or whatever. And this is just setting up a system of similar to what happened in Germany. And so again, 9 principles. I'm not going to go through them all. We went through them rather quickly. I realize they're not necessarily all connected, but they're principles that I have found in the last couple of years in studying this, especially the last few months, is principles that I want to understand more about. I want to realize that, go home and apologize to my wife where I have limited her liberties, in areas that I might have done that. How am I acting in my own church, How do we apply these things in our own sphere that we're in? So tomorrow, I'm going to talk about liberty of conscience and just, I don't know where I've been the last 25 years, but just realizing that A.T. Jones preached on liberty of conscience issues in Minneapolis, and we have his document that he published in February of 1889 saying, this is what I presented at Minneapolis. And then we also have a rich history of what happened when he went to Battle Creek following that and spoke on the very same topics with the endorsement of Ellen White being there. And in fact, if it hadn't been for Ellen White, he wouldn't have ended up being able to speak. So we'll cover that, some of that more history. It'll be more, succinct and chronological. Tonight was more just kind of going off from where Ricky went yesterday and just touching on some of these religious principles. So unless you have some questions, I know that I've kept you exactly 61 minutes. And I'm just, it's something that I'm going to continue to study and I want to understand better. And obviously, like that first statement, be able to present it in a way that, I don't lop people's heads off. But
yeah, we could maybe spend 10, 15 minutes discussion. But I was going to kind of, we focus a lot on Babylon and Rome in Revelation, but the other country there is Egypt. And when you're talking about the Pharisees and Sadducees
right.
and the different political parties, and I think in Revelation we don't really focus that much on Egypt, but that's one of those powers from the bottomless pit.
Right. Spiritualism, which that was a whole section I took out was on spiritualism. I was surprised at how quickly it grew from the 1840s. I mean, enormous. How it, and of course it's still obviously around today, even more active. So.
When you had that last statement there about, it seemed like something out of current papers. Ellen White, that quote where she says, "Time is very short," and then she says, "quote, and such it has always been presented to me."
Yeah.
And I sort of take from that the conditions in the world have been right.
Yes, amen.
All along.
Yeah.
And the missing ingredient
yes.
has always been God's people.
Exactly. God isn't waiting for Satan to figure out how to do the final end time events. He's waiting for God's people to be ready for the end time events so that he can...
So if we believe that Christ could have come, or even 1863, then these prophecies would have had to been in place and fulfilled in that time.
Yeah.
And then we believe that he could have come in the 1890s or shortly after that, then these prophecies would be fulfilled there. And if this is happening every generation, then they kind of ebb and go back and forth, but we see it continually getting worse and worse and worse. But those prophecies we could point to being fulfilled in that day.
Yeah, and it's been helpful to me too because I realized there's a lot of parallelism to today. I mean, there's kind of this idea, well, the religious right is dead, so nothing to worry about. Well, what's going on right now that's preparing for something that may be under the surface? In fact, I read a statement made by a politician just a year and a half ago, just berating church and state, the separation of church and state, and saying we need to once and for all get rid of this and bring morality back into our country. Well, I'm for morality, but not that kind of morality, because it will be under the wrong, form, as you all know. So, any other thoughts? Thank you, Brian and Bob.
One other, or two actually, kind of two thoughts. I appreciate. I think that probably all of us recognize that our Constitution came in, but because of slavery, in particular, which is such a glaring example, we've always had this from the very beginning of our country's time. We've had a problem. But I appreciate you calling it the dragon speaking. I guess I haven't.
That's
labeled it.
That's what they describe it as. Yeah.
But then also the dual thought though is that this is probably the closest government that mirrors how God operates. It's never been instituted in the history of the world. Maybe Israel, you could go back to some of that, but kind of in the last couple thousand years. And so whole idea of this, you know, the civil and religious liberty is under such attack right now.
Yeah.
A lot of it's been directly because of slavery too, right? So
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting that
Yeah.
speaking of the dragon that we did as a country is also undermining
Yes,
the good principles
exactly.
that God set up in our
Right.
country.
So the devil plays
The
both
emperor and
sides.
the
Yeah.
church, here we have this inspired, you know, these inspired statements, and unfortunately,
Yeah.
as a church, we fell really short, right? You
Yeah.
know, we had tremendous racism in our church that
Yeah.
it's been uncovered, you know, really the last 10, 20 years.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. We haven't been able to speak with the power that we could have.
Yes, I think you're right. Yeah, and I mean, as you know, Ellen White talked about, the work in the South too. I mean, it was hard go there, and I don't know that that's totally solved. So
It's just making me think, and maybe this is a crazy statement, but that God's way of government is actually pretty tenuous.
And-
Freedom is a risk.
it
Depends
is.
on the consent of the people that
Yeah.
rule.
It
Yeah,
is.
that's right.
Absolutely depends on the people being ruled.
And that shows out
So
in
our living in this country is very tenuous.
yeah.
Yeah.
And this what you have been saying here makes me think, as because Ellen White talks about, in calling attention to the fact that Babylon has fallen, obviously we need to know what Babylon's fallen from. And pointing out in other areas where Babylon's fallen, I don't think that means go out and railing on the sins, but I think a positive way is actually show this is why God raised up this nation, and here's the principles of his kingdom, and then it's almost easier, it's easier than to see where has that fallen short, and where is that falling short in principles that the papacy operates on. And even though it may have a fair front in some circles today, it's still actively involved in world events, and we need to be awake on that. Yes.
Two comments. As a naturalized American and an Adventist, I believe that the raising of America was important for the teaching of the cleansing of the sanctuary.
Mm-hmm.
Because the cleansing of the sanctuary is important to understand Leviticus conscience on an individual basis. And so
Yeah.
God raised America for that purpose, largely. As a model. As a model. Yeah. And so the second comment that I have is in South Africa, where until 1989 we experienced racism. If our church understood civil and religious liberty in the context that we present tonight, we would not have said, when I was a young man in South Africa, let's not raise our voices against apartheid, because when Sunday law comes is when we need to use our voices. And so the argument that we're using now is not a good one, because in South Africa we failed God's name
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, like I said, I can't believe how much I don't know in studying all these things, just, on history itself, and just expanding, the idea that God, this country was specifically raised up for the purpose of taking the three angels' message from this point to the world, And so how much more important that, that's part of the message that goes, is this, God is a God of liberty, but he's also seeking to free us from sin, and like you said, the sanctuary, and
And the Constitution of the United States was adopted by a large number of countries.
That was the whole section I took out, was the effect of this Constitution has had on other countries. And yet today I wonder, with America having all these military bases all over the world, are other countries beginning to, are they following the examples of negative,
Personally, I'm doing
yeah.
that amazing.
Yeah, so, okay, thank you for your patience, and I would just encourage us all, keep your eyes open, keep studying, and I do believe that, and I'll talk about this more tomorrow, that, a big part of the message that Jones and Wagner did preach about was these liberty of conscience ideas, and obviously I haven't even scratched the surface on the things they were dealing with. So, did you have a?
No, I didn't. I would say this, going to the Declaration of Independence. There's a paragraph. First paragraph is taken out of the original. Jefferson put in there would have ended the slavery.
Oh.
He was a slave holder, but there were two states, South Carolina, I believe, and Georgia, that would not sign the Declaration of Independence unless that was taken out. So it was removed. But he died a slaveholder, but I believe he believed in it, of freedom, and it would have begun to take place shortly after the
Constitution.
Declaration.
Okay, I read a statement that I took out that is puzzling to me from Uriah Smith, where he's quoting from someone that brought this very thing up, that slavery, the slavery as it was initially came, it was from Europe pushing on the colonies, but that a lot, and so it's like, okay, well, I don't know what he's talking about, so, but that makes sense.
If you read the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson took issue with the king, and he said, in fact in that paragraph is even explicitly stated, but he said, you're the one that imposed that upon this United States, of the colonies.
Yeah.
And he said, you're responsible for it. Very strong language that he used.
Interesting. Yeah. More reading to do. So, well, shall we close with prayer? Do you have anything much? Okay. Father, we do thank you, Lord, that your government has been built on liberty, and Lord, that your idea of liberty was more important than sparing even your own son, so that you would allow us that choice in this great controversy. And Father, I pray tonight that we would not use that freedom of choice to walk contrary to you, Lord, but we would allow you to write that law in our hearts, and that we would follow you and truly enter into that freedom that you want to give all of us. Lord, I pray too that you'll give us wisdom and understanding, and as we look at the world we're living in today. And Lord, may we recognize not only your leading, but the leading and what you want us to do as we present this message that's to turn the world upside down. I pray also, Lord, that we would see wherein these liberties are being challenged, and be willing to, through your guidance, speak in the behalf of those whose liberties are being taken away. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.